Welcome to the next episode of the tutorial walkthrough series of Fortune and Glory, the Cliffhanger game. This episode will focus on the cooperative and solo games. The solo game is just a variant of the cooperative game. I won't focus on the team game because it's essentially the competitive game with a couple of extra rules described on page 26. Since we've already learned so much in the previous episodes, this episode will actually have two adventures in it. The basic cooperative game and the advanced cooperative game. The main difference is that the basic game does not have the vial organizations. Set up just like a normal game, but also get out the villain event cards, the villain tracker, and the villain track marker. Board Game Geek has a villain sheet that is very helpful in tracking the villains in the competitive game. If you've printed that out, take it and put it to the side of the board to track the villains. On page 22, there's a chart that shows that for the number of players that playing in the cooperative game, how much fortune they need to gain in order to win, how many villains are active when playing, and on the villain track, how far the villains need to reach in order for the villains to win. In the advanced games, you will choose the villains according to their vial organization that you're playing against, but in this basic game, you can mix them up if you want. Randomly select the number of villains as shown on the chart and place them on the villain chart and place the figures in the ready state. Place the villain draw deck on the draw space. When you discard, place it up above. Set the marker on 0 on the villain track. Once you've placed your artifacts, take the villain that's the first from the left and place it on the board. You'll place the villain at the location that has the greatest fortune. If you're tied, then you go to the least danger. If you're still tied, then the players decide where to place the villain. The figure for the second villain is placed on the ready spot. If you're using a third villain, then you place that villain on the delayed spot. And this time, instead of using the competitive side of the round summary, turn it over to the cooperative side, and you can see the main difference is that there's a villain phase in between the adventure phase and the end phase. Most of the gameplay is exactly the same as for the competitive version, but here's some of the rule differences. Since all the heroes are working together to defeat the villains, you can combine your fortune together to see when you win the game. Also, when your hero is KO'd, you never have to lose fortune. Glory, on the other hand, is not shared, it's kept individually. However, when heroes work together to defeat an enemy or complete a danger, they gain the full glory for each hero. When heroes are in a common space, they can exchange allies, gear, or common items, but they cannot exchange event cards, city cards, or glory. When there are multiple heroes adventuring at a site, you draw one danger card for all the heroes, and the players can decide which hero takes the test. If there are multiple tests to take, you can decide which hero takes each of the tests. It can be the same hero or different heroes. So if Jake and Ginny were attempting to pass the We're Not Alone test with cunning and agility, it would probably be best to have Jake do the agility and Ginny do the cunning because of their skill levels. Any heroes that are at the site but not actively taking the test can exert to add a dice to the roll, even if it's not a cliffhanger. If the test is failed, it's failed for all the heroes and then the card is flipped over to the cliffhanger sign just like normal. If you pass the test, then the heroes can decide to press on or camp down. And they don't have to do the same thing, so some heroes could camp down while others press on. Any heroes that do camp down cannot participate anymore in the adventure in this round. When multiple heroes are involved in a fight with an enemy, they must trade off rounds fighting the enemy until the enemy is defeated, they are all KO'd, or they all escape. The players decide the order in which the heroes will fight. When it comes to fighting a villain, each of the heroes must fight the villain on their own. When an escape test needs to be passed, all heroes must pass it, both for fighting enemies and for collapsing temples. When the heroes need to do a sneak test, they can all pick different numbers or they could pick the same number, but the dice are all rolled once for all the heroes. When heroes collect an artifact, they must decide who's going to carry it. So now let's talk about the villain phase. The First thing that happens in the villain phase is you draw a villain event card. There are multiple copies of the Vile Tactics card, and there are two parts to it. One is dealt with in the Vile Organization's Tactics, and we're going to skip that for the basic game. And the second part is to move the villain track one step forward. So, for example, we would just move this ring to the next step. Like normal event cards, you typically are just going to read what the villain event card tells you to do. But there are a couple of things that we want to point out. One of those is the random villain in play. By in play, we mean all of the villains that are out on the board and any of the villains that are back in base that's represented by this villain sheet. So in this case, a random villain gets +1 combat. So the easiest way to do that is just to roll a dice to see which villain is going to get this ability. The other thing to point out is that some of the villain cards tell you to take an extra villain adventure step. As you can see in the villain phase, you're supposed to draw a villain event, do outpost and villain step. We'll talk about that in the advanced game. And then you do the villain adventure step. So if the villain event card has an extra villain step, they'll actually do it twice. So for any villain that's out on the board searching for an artifact, they just go through the typical search step. However, if the villain is back at the base, they move one step forward. So for example, if they're KO'd, they'll move to the delayed state. If they're delayed, they move to the ready state. And if they're ready, they're deployed. So that means they would go to the place where the artifact has the greatest fortune and the least danger, just like at the beginning of the game. Whenever villains gain fortune, such as searching a temple, they bring it back to the base and place it up in this area. When they've gained 3 fortune, then that fortune is removed and the track marker is moved up 1 step. Whenever the last fortune is taken from a temple, the fortune is placed in the tracking location. The cards are placed back into the discard, and the temple treasure is placed in this area. Since the temple treasure counts as collecting an artifact, the track step is moved up 2 steps. So it's moved up 2 steps for each artifact that's collected by villains. So normal artifacts can just be placed in the treasure vault here. And of course you would move up 2 steps on the track. Anytime you would normally return a villain figure from the board, they are fully healed. If they're an active villain, the figure goes back to the base and is placed back on their villain card. So for example, if the villain was KO'd, they are fully healed, but they're placed on the KO space. If the villain is taken off the board because the hero gained the artifact or a temple collapsed, then the villain is placed on the delayed spot. If the villain was the one that collected the artifact, then they're placed on the ready space so that they will then be deployed to the board on the next villain action phase. If a henchman is to be placed on the board where one already exists, or if all of the henchmen are already placed out on the board, then you move the track marker 1 step forward. Moving the track marker forward is how the villains win the game. So now you know how the track marker moves forward. If it ever reaches the value that's shown in the victory chart, then the villains win. Now we'll talk about the solo game. You can play a cooperative game multi-handed for one way of playing solo. The only difference there is that you only have 1 set of secret cards and event cards for all of the heroes. If you decide to play true solo, then here are the rules that you need to change. First, you will skip the initiative phase, and on the move phase, you will actually roll 2 dice and choose the one you want. Anytime doubles are rolled, you gain an event card. If you roll double ones, you gain 2 event cards. If you roll a 1 and some other number and you choose to move 1, then you gain an event card. And just like in the standard cooperative mode, you are never forced to lose fortune if you're knocked out. Now we've explained how to play the basic cooperative or solo version. You can pause the video now and try it yourself. See if you can gain enough fortune to defeat the villains. Then come back and we'll cover how to deal with the vile organizations. Now it's time to focus on the vile organizations in the cooperative and solo play. This will complete the instructions for the base game. So for the setup, you'll get out just about everything that the game has. Well, the only things that we won't be using are a few things that came with the expansion, such as the personal missions, the major city epic events, the dock tokens, the reward tokens, minor city tokens, and the personal tokens that come with the expansions. At the beginning of the cooperative or solo game, you will choose a vile organization that you will fight against: the mob, the Nazis, or the Order of the Crimson Hand. These tiles are called the organization record sheets, and they're single-sided and give you the special abilities of each organization. In addition to spelling out the special abilities, each organization has a thing that's generically called outposts. They're locations on the map, and each organization calls them a little bit different things, such as the mobs call them hideouts and mob HQ. And this section of the record sheet details how you set those up at the starting of the game. The mobsters, Nazi soldiers, and acolytes described on the bottom of the organization sheets are the henchmen that we've described earlier. In addition to the record sheet, each organization also has a double-sided tile that has information about the outpost and tactics. We're looking at the outpost side here. So as we look at the cooperative game summary, the outposts come into play during the villain phase. We've already talked about drawing villain events and the villain adventure step. So in between those is the outpost or Zeppelin step. It's called the Zeppelin step as well as the outpost because in the Nazi vile organization, the Zeppelin is involved as well as outposts. For each of the vile organizations, the top part of the outpost chart shows what happens during the outpost step of the villain phase. On the bottom, it details how to destroy those outposts for the organization. The rewards you get for destroying an outpost are not described on the outpost chart, but they're described in the basic rules themselves. If you destroy an outpost, it is of course removed from play, and then the hero may choose to do either one of two things. They can steal an artifact if the organization has one. They can then later sell that artifact to gain the fortune, or they can collect the fortune that the villains already have and move the track marker back 3 steps. They do not move the track marker back if they collect the artifact, and the track marker cannot go below 0. On the back of the outpost charts are the organization tactic charts. These effects will be triggered when you draw the Vile Tactics card from the Villain Event deck. The first step of that card tells you to roll a dice and then apply the tactic that the dice shows. The first tactic on each of the organizations is to place a new outpost out on the map. But the other tactics are special to the organization and give them each their special flavor. So now you're ready for your next adventure. The gameplay is the same as the basic cooperative and solo adventure, except that you'll choose one of the vile organizations to compete against. Follow the rules that the cards show about setup, and note their special abilities. And then just recall that you have to do an outpost step during the villain phase. Have fun playing and defeat those villains. The rest of the video will not introduce another adventure, but instead it's just going to explain the specific abilities of each of the different organizations. Now we'll go through the special abilities of each of the vile organizations. Let's talk about the mob organization. The mob likes to intimidate your allies, so whenever an ally is going to activate an ability, they have to do a loyalty test of 4+ before they can execute the ability. If the test is passed, the ability works as normal, but if it fails, then the ability is canceled and the ally is discarded. Each ally will have a loyalty value in the bottom. That's the number of dice that you roll to do the loyalty test. So you roll those dice and compare them against the loyalty success value. In this case, it's a 4+. So if we roll these 2 dice, and at least one of them is equal to the test value or greater, you're successful. The mob also likes extortion, so all gear and common items cost an extra 2 glory for heroes to buy. For the outposts at the beginning of the game, the mob headquarters will be placed in Chicago. Then a mob hideout will be placed at a random city on the board. There's only one mob headquarters, but there are multiple hideouts that can be on the board. If the mob headquarters is ever destroyed, it is placed at a random location at the next end phase. During the outpost step of the villain phase, roll a d6 for the mob HQ. On a roll of 4, 5, or 6, place a mobster thug and a random city on the board. If there's already a mobster thug there, instead move the villain track one step forward. In addition, during the outpost step, for each hideout on the board, you gain 1 fortune for the villains. Since the mobsters are in cities, you have to first draw a city card and resolve the city event first. But if you're trying to destroy the outpost, you can do that before or after the purchase step. To destroy the outpost, you'll have to do a sneak test with using a search value of 8. For every search die that found them, you have to fight against a mobster. And during the fight, each mobster has a +1 defense. You'll fight the mobsters one at a time. You can't escape like normal, or between the fights of the mobsters, not between the rounds, but between mobsters, you can escape for free. However, if you escape, the outpost is not destroyed. If you successfully sneak through and or defeat any mobsters, then the outpost is destroyed. For the mob tactics, for a roll of 1 to 3, you place a new mob hideout in a random city. If there's already a hideout or mob HQ in that city, redraw the random city. For a roll of 4 or 5, you execute the kidnapping tactic. Every hero with at least one ally has to roll a die, and the hero that has the lowest die, if you get a tie, re-roll, has an ally that's kidnapped. The ally with the highest loyalty, if it's tied, you choose, is kidnapped and must be placed on the villain sheet. While that ally is kidnapped, you can't do anything in the normal game. And of course, if the heroes don't have any allies, the villain track is moved up 1. And an ally from the top of the allies deck is placed on the villain sheet. If the ally is not rescued by the time the next Vile Tactics card is drawn, then the ally is removed from the game and the villain track is moved up 1 step. If, however, a hero destroys either a hideout or the mob HQ, they can rescue any one ally on the villain sheet. When they do that, they gain the ally to their list of allies. If you roll a 6, then the mob executes a hit. When that happens, each hero must roll a die, and the hero with the lowest die roll must either lose an ally or take d6 hits. So let's talk about the Nazi organization. Anytime a Nazi villain is placed into play, it's associated with 2 soldier bodyguards. The Nazis will start the game with a secret base, a Nazi soldier, and the War Zeppelin in a random location on the board. The War Zeppelin is just a more powerful version of the Zeppelin. Any Nazi enemies and villains in the same place as the War Zeppelin or adjacent spaces gain +2 fight dice. During the villain phase, you draw a random location card and roll a d6. The Zeppelin will move toward the shortest path toward that location. If there's multiple options for the shortest path, the first player decides the direction. If the Zeppelin reaches the location it was headed towards, place a Nazi soldier in that location. A hero in the same location as the Zeppelin can try to sneak aboard the Zeppelin with a search value of 5. However, the War Zeppelin is well guarded, so you actually have to choose 2 numbers to test against. If discovered, the hero has to fight a Nazi soldier for every search die that found him. The hero fights each soldier separately. They can escape like normal, or between fights of the different soldiers, they can escape for free. However, if they do escape, they do not defeat the Zeppelin. You can't use guns or explosives during a fight aboard the Zeppelin. If the hero is able to sneak past the soldiers and or defeat them, then the Zeppelin is destroyed. The heroes will gain the bonus as if the Zeppelin were an outpost. And then the Zeppelin is placed back on the board at a random location at the next end phase. During the outpost step, you roll a die for each secret base that exists on the board. For a roll of 4, 5, or 6, you draw a random location and place a Nazi soldier there. If there's already a Nazi soldier in that location, you of course move the villain track up 1. To destroy the secret base, the hero must find it and attack it as if it were a normal artifact using the danger effect. So once it passes 3 dangers, then the base is destroyed. For the Nazi tactics, if you roll a 1 or a 2, then you'll place a new secret base at a random location. If the secret base already exists there, redraw. For a roll of 3 or 4, place 2 Nazi soldiers in separate random locations on the board. In addition, for that role, any hero in a space adjacent to a Nazi soldier must fight that Nazi soldier outside their normal turn sequence. Similarly, for that same role, any hero in or adjacent to a villain must fight one round with the villain. For a role of 5 or 6, the Nazi occupation marker must be placed in a city next to a Nazi soldier. Anytime a hero moves into a city with an occupation token, the hero must draw a Nazi enemy card and fight the Nazi enemy. If the Nazi enemy is defeated, the occupation marker is removed from the city. Let's talk about the Order of the Crimson Hand organization. As the Crimson Hand villains gain artifacts, they gain special powers, denoted by special symbols as shown here. However, you should note that the symbols are actually shown on the adventure cards, not on the artifact cards themselves. As villains discovered artifacts with these special symbols, they can place a token matching these symbols on the tracking sheet. If villains have gained the myth artifact, then the acolytes can gain an extra success when they're adventuring. If they gain the fate artifact, then all rolls on the tactic sheet gain +1. If they've gained the magic artifact, then all Crimson Hand villains and enemies gain +1 fight dice. If they've gained the death artifact, then all Crimson Hand villains and enemies gain +1 health, or that means they can take 1 more wound. Once per turn, heroes in a city can purchase allies for -2 glory, so typically that's 3. The villains start with the Dark Sanctuary in a random location. At the start of the villain phase, if there are no Dark Sanctuaries on the board, draw a random location and place a Dark Sanctuary there. When you roll the tactics die, you must also roll a die for every ally in play. On a roll of 4, 5, or 6, the ally is able to resist the influence of the Crimson Hand. On a roll of 1, 2, or 3, they take a -1 loyalty and must roll the die again. Whenever an ally's loyalty drops to 0, they are discarded from the game, and the associated hero must lose D3 fortune. On a tactics roll of 1, 2, or 3, you draw a random location and place a Dark Sanctuary in that location. If that location already has a Dark Sanctuary, then you redraw. For a roll of 4 or 5, every hero must fight a dark creature outside of the normal turn sequence. On a roll of 6 or greater, because the fate icon gives them a +1 roll, you will draw a random villain and place their figure in the ready state. So this means that you might have more than 3 active villains in the game at a time. If the villain successfully collects an artifact or is KO'd, they're removed from play and are no longer considered an active villain. However, if they had gained a remains in play attribute such as tenacious, that will stay with the villain. That way, if the villain ever becomes active again, they will keep that ability. Wow, that's a lot of stuff, and can you believe it? There's even more. But we've covered everything in the basic game. So that's it for this episode. Give it a try yourself, and join me again on the next episode of Fortune and Glory, the Cliffhanger game.